Hello, Brobs. We return with Napoleon, Bisexual Emperor by Major General Frank Richardson, M.D. Chapter 1's fairly long, and don't plan on reading the entire thing. I'll probably break it up into two parts if you don't like it. I mean, there's always biblio.com. You can buy the book. I'll read it will and how I like, and I will go in between fake accents and my normal grating voice. Chapter 1, The Complex Character of Napoleon. Most of us must be aware of a good side and a bad side to our nature, and it was not unusually perceptive of Napoleon to say of himself, "There are two men in me." Man, oh, don't tell me he had threesomes too, my God. Oh, man. Ooh. Oh, shit, this is already devolving. The man of braids and the man of art, that is hot. But he never did anything by halves, and unlike other historical characters, in whom there is usually some agreement between the good and the bad portraits, something discernible of the same general outline in Napoleon's case, the contrasts in his nature were so pronounced that we might be reading about two entirely different men. Well, three, as it were. Archbishop Whately even published a pamphlet casting doubt on the existence of Napoleon, suggesting that the name could have been applied to any successful French general of the period. This, we are told by the Dictionary of National Biography, was in the nature of a philosophical exercise designed to hoist Hume with his own petard, but it seems a bit excessive to have carried the ponderous arch-episcopal legpole through at least 10 editions between 1841 and 1865. The same theme had been used by an earlier author, Jean-Baptiste Paris, in the Grand Erratum, the non-existence of Napoleon proved in 1827. But whether he was joking or serious, we can agree with the Archbishop when he says that it is certain that to no one were ever assigned so many dissimilar characters. An English writer, W.H. Hudson, who in 1915 ended his book about Napoleon with the verdict, "a colossal image with feet of clay," and admitted that his feelings for him were not admiration but aversion, not unmingled with pity and contempt, was perhaps going a bit too far, but he was echoing similar expressions used in the previous century by the historian J.A. Froude. Other writers have gone just as far in the opposite direction, almost deifying Napoleon and reverently using capital letters when the pronouns him and his refer to the revolution-made man. Goethe referred to him as a demonic being, neither good nor devil, but something in between. And many writers have devoted chapters to the devil or angel theme. Marshal Marmont, one of his oldest friends, said, "There are two men in him, physically and morally," and the French historian Young called him a living synthesis of good and evil. Madame de Remusat, I don't know how the fuck to say it, who once loved him, finally came to see only the bad side and wrote, "Bonaparte has an innate evil nature, an innate taste for evil in great things as in small." His dual nature was perceptible quite early in his career, and when he was about 27, Madame Permon, a friend of his mother, who had befriended him in his early days in Paris, said to him, "Napoleon, there are two men in you at this moment. Continue, I entreat you, to be the man I love and esteem, and above all, do not let the other get the better of you." Was he a religious man? Or did he simply realize the value of religious faith to an army and a nation at war, regarding religion as the Napoleonic authority Holland Rose believed he did, as the useful handmaid of the ruler? Were cruelty and callousness part of his nature, or could it have been just that he knew that a general must sometimes accept the risk of casualties in the broader interest of a successful battle which may shorten a campaign, and in the end forestall further losses? Was his magnetic power over men's hearts just a trick to enslave those whom he regarded as the true tools of his ambition, whom he even despised? For we shall see in chapter 3 that he actually despised the French. Did he care for his soldiers as much as they believed that he did? Were his dreadful rages partly feigned in order to frighten people? These and other aspects of his character must now be considered. To present Napoleon as Antichrist personified was a convenient weapon in the wartime propaganda of his enemies, and he made their task easy by his frequently expressed disbelief in Christianity and his harsh treatment of the Pope. When Pius VII, after many disagreements, excommunicated Napoleon, the emperor deported the pontiff to internment in Savona, or is it Savona, relieving him of his archives, his tiara, and the fisherman's ring, which were carried off to Paris. All this without a single French official resigning his office in a country still nominally Catholic. On the other hand, he earned the gratitude of French Christians by the Concordat. I told you I don't know shit about Napoleon, let alone France, which restored much of the influence of the church, which the revolution had destroyed. This called for moral courage, and by no means all his sturdily Republican generals supported him. The story is told of an answer given to Napoleon by General Delmas after the first celebration of High Mass in Notre Dame in 1802. When asked if he did not think it splendid, Delmas replied, "All that was missing was 1,000,000 men who have laid down their lives to destroy what you are building up." A pointer to his own attitude is the remark which he once made to General Bertrand: "If you do not understand that Jesus Christ is God, well, I was wrong in making you a general." He was too sound a psychologist to underestimate the power of religious faith as an element in the morale of armies. Napoleon was not only the leader of an army, but of a great nation, and whatever he may have said in private, he knew that his public face must be seen to be that of a true believer. His professed interest in Mohammedanism and openly declared thoughts of embracing that faith coincided with his dreams of Eastern conquest, and he himself said, "I was a Mohammedan in Egypt. I shall be a Catholic in France." He may have turned away without comment from General Delmas in 1802 in the Cathedral of Notre Dame, but by 1811 he felt himself to be on firmer ground. During a little ceremony at which he entrusted to Madame de Montesquieu the care of the imperial children, there was only one, but he was always an optimist. He said, make my son a good Frenchman and a good Christian." Then, seeing cynical smiles among the courtiers who remembered his own outspoken disbelief, he added sharply, "The one cannot go without the other." It was in him a matter of supreme importance that the self-made dynasty which he was intent upon founding should been seen. See, I'm not totally illiterate. Should been seen by all to have church's blessings. Hey, listen, if a fucking multi-billion-dollar publisher can make mistakes, I can read this sentence incorrectly. That he himself should take his place among the anointed ones, rulers of Europe by divine right, into whose hallowed community he so ardently longed to enter on equal terms. It was essential to him to quell a deep sense of social inferiority. He was more often in conflict than in agreement with the church, but it is hard to quarrel with his own comment. I do not believe in forms of religion, but in the existence of a God. He said more than once that he sought to get faith because human nature had need of the supernatural. This practical realist was not only surprisingly romantic at heart, but intensely superstitious, with a strong belief in destiny and in his star, which he once actually pointed out in the sky to Cardinal Fesch. Napoleon's extremely superstitious nature has been attributed to an Arab or Berber strain, which he shared with the natives of that part of Corsica where he was born. As for his star, General de Gaulle had this to say in his book, Le Fil de l'Épée, what Alexander called his hope, Caesar his fortune, and Napoleon his star. Was this not simply the certain knowledge that a particular gift puts them in such close relation to reality that they dominate it always? Delicious ponderings. Napoleon would have liked this, for he loved to think of himself as the successor to great historical figures, Charlemagne, Caesar, and especially Alexander, who had the good luck to be both a conqueror and a god. Napoleon could not quite bring himself to claim divinity, but might have liked to do so had he thought that the French people would stomach it. It is hard to see how, in the 19th century, he could have gone much further, or how he escaped ridicule for the lengths to which he did go. The idea of having a remote ancestor, brother Boniface Bonaparte, was that Buonaparte, canonized, was apparently not taken very seriously by Napoleon or by the church, but he actually succeeded in having the day after his own birthday named and celebrated as St. Napoleon's Day. August 15th was already booked as the Feast of the Assumption, and Pius VII would not budge on that, but Napoleon succeeded in having Saint Roche, whose day was August 16th, sacrificed, thus killing two birds with one stone, conveying a mark of imperial displeasure to the curé of the parish of Saint Roche, who had refused Christian burial to Mademoiselle Chameroy, a dancer at the opera, a more evil piece of sacrilege, and one smelling of Hitler's indoctrination of the Hitler Jugend, was the introduction of the Imperial Catechism, which, amongst other subtler provisions, taught children that the Emperor was the image of God on earth, and those who were lacking in their duty towards our Emperor resist the order established by God himself, and rendered themselves worthy of eternal damnation. It might be unfair to blame Napoleon for such utterances as one made by a senator and president of the Tribune, who likened Napoleon's mother, Madame Marie, to the Virgin Mary, adding, "The conception which you had in bearing within your womb the great Napoleon was assuredly nothing else but a divine inspiration." No public rebuke followed this profane nonsense, so perhaps the emperor was not unduly offended by it. It has been suggested that his hostility to Christianity originated at the military school of Brienne, where he was severely beaten for his rebellious attitude to the priests, and where he once actually fought with a priest who had made insulting remarks about Corsica after the young cadet had made his confession. But childhood influences are far more important to this connection, and it may be said that anyone who has received Christian teaching at his mother's knee cannot put it out of his life with impunity. From the psychological point of view, Napoleon hit this nail on the head when he said, "My intellect prevents me from believing, but the impressions of my childhood and early youth bring me back to the unknown." He said that he was always deeply moved by the sound of distant church bells. He was certainly brought up in the Catholic faith by a devout and strict mother, and he appeared to turn to the church at the end and to die a practicing Catholic. Let us leave it at that for the present. The wartime propagandists were on surer ground when they called him an inhuman monster to whom men were little more than the tools of his ambition. They could point to the cruel political murder of the young Duke of Enghien, forgive my ignorance, the indiscriminate shooting of civilians, especially in Germany, and they could quote his cry about Sir John Moore's army in 1809, that these 20,000 were 100,000, that more English mothers might feel the horrors of war. In 1813, Napoleon played into the hands of his critics when, in a notorious interview in the Marcolini Palace in Dresden, he lost his temper and yelled at Metternich, "I was brought up in the field, and a man such as I am does not concern himself with the lives of 1,000,000 men." Metternich said that Napoleon actually used an extremely coarse expression, and an American general, J. Watts de Peyster, who seems to have devoted much of his time to collecting every scrap of discreditable evidence against Napoleon, supplied the dirty words and makes it 2,000,000 men. In his description of the astounding scene, Metternich spared no effort to show Napoleon in a bad light, and himself as a calm, wise statesman, but it is most likely that Napoleon was goaded to that terrible outburst by Metternich's allusions to the raw youths composing Napoleon's armies, whom he was prepared to send to their deaths rather than risk the threat to his reputation and his throne, which would have resulted from an agreement to give up any part of his former conquest. He knew how weary his country was of war, so it might be unfair to attach too much significance to those terrible words, on which many historians have relied in blackening Napoleon's name. But at this time in his life he often mentioned his losses in a most casual way, and he wrote to the Empress that he had lost no one of any importance, though the casualties had amounted to thousands. Describing the devotion to his troops, Napoleon made the macabre boast that with the last drop of blood gushing from their veins, they cried, "Vive Empereur!" He had a strange fascination for viewing the corpses of men who had been slain doing his bidding. This unpleasant obsession has been mentioned by many writers, including Tolstoy, who described it in War and Peace, written when survivors of 1812 must have been as numerous as our old contemptibles are today. A pamphlet published in Paris in 1814, La Conversion d'un Grand Prêcheur, purported to represent the emperor confessing to a priest that he took pleasure in seeing men sacrificed for him. It has been said that it seemed to reinforce his sense of power, and it was first manifested quite early in his career, when he was beginning to realize what he might come to mean to France. Napoleon himself admitted to having felt a strange, unnatural pleasure at the sight of the bloody corpse of Colonel Miron, who sacrificed his life to save Napoleon's, accepting death in his place. Simplement pas quoi. On the hideous field of Eylau, even Napoleon was sufficiently shaken to exclaim, "Awful spectacle! A sight such as this should inspire rulers with the love of peace and abhorrence of war." But his callous nature reasserted itself when he actually turned over with his foot the corpses of some of his soldiers, remarking, "Small change, small change. A knight of Paris will soon adjust these losses." It was said that after Wagram, he personally directed the collection of wounded, saying that after a battle, these are no longer enemies, only men, the good side for once. Sir Walter Scott, by no means a friendly critic, said that Napoleon could never bear to see suffering without displaying compassion. It may be unfair to suggest that the significant word here is displaying. Napoleon was too shrewd to overlook the effect on his popularity of a display of compassion. To be fair, it should be conceded that a great general must steel himself to the risk of casualties. He who cannot look upon a battle dry-eyed allows men to be killed needlessly, as Napoleon himself said. But callousness is quite another matter, and for this Napoleon began towards the end to pay the price in a lessening of the loyalty of many of his generals and some of his troops. This waning of loyalty at his megalomania and disregard for men's lives became more evident was echoed in the hearts of many Frenchmen after the emperor's abandonment of the survivors of the great army with which he had invaded Russia. Before leaving them, whilst watching the crossing of the Beresina, he had seen hundreds of poor creatures struggling in the icy river after the pontoon bridge had broken. All their emperor could find to say was, "Voyez si grapparos." Few of those poor toads survived to curse him. But a turning point in the devotion of his subjects was the shock of reading in his memorable 29th bulletin, announcing the loss of nearly 500,000 men, the bland assurance that the emperor's health had never been better. "Families, dry your tears, Napoleon is well," was Chateaubriand's bitter comment. By this time, of course, he was identifying his own interests with those of France, but surely only a cold-hearted dictator could have said, as he did, that he could afford to expend 100,000 men a year. This condemns him out of his own mouth and is comparable with a still more nauseous remark attributed to Mussolini when he said the Badaglio, "I need only a few thousand dead to ensure that I have the right to sit at the peace table in the capacity of a co-belligerent." Napoleon's callousness may have grown with his increasing megalomania, but there is evidence of it long before he had become a dictator. Never mind the shadow. Anyway, pardon if you can't see it because my battery has gotten too low for flash. Anyway, Napoleon's secretary, de Beauharnais, who had known him since they were both 9 years old, tells us that Napoleon's heart was naturally cold, and even in his youth he was little disposed to form friendships. It was one of Bonaparte's greatest misfortunes not to believe in friendship, or to experience the need of love, the need to love. How often have I heard him say, "Friendship is only a word. I care for nobody." Probably it was, as he says, Napoleon's misfortune to be like that, and we ought not, perhaps, to be too hard on the man whose unfeeling nature could have been at least partly the result of being pitchforked at the age of 9, the only little Corsican, and an odd little boy at that, into the rough and tumble of a military school, to be left there for 5 years with only rate family contacts. De Beauharnais was one of his closest friends at school, but he was never such an intimate confidant as Caulaincourt, a much more reliable witness, and unlike de Beauharnais, I know I'm butchering that too, and some others who have presumed to judge Napoleon, a man of fine character, a true and trusted friend. Caulaincourt, I'll say it's Caulaincourt. Caulaincourt? Sounds Russian. Caulaincourt wrote that Napoleon often told him that he hardly knew what affection meant. He said, "It is doubtless a pity, but matters of sentiment, the heartfelt emotions so-called, have no share in my organization." He went on to explain to Caulaincourt that for him the heart was not the organ of sentiment, that he felt nothing in the heart, everything in the loins. And in another place, which I shall leave nameless, but that though it must have been his butthole, right? I mean, what else could it be? Or I shall leave nameless. But those emotions of his, or does the loins just mean his loins and not his package? Those emotions that were never very strong. Napoleon was much given to this sort of self-analysis, and the best evidence about his true nature is to be obtained from his own sayings, which abundantly confirm the views of those who have described him as an unfriendly, unloving man, interested in people only if they could be of use to him, strangely unable to give or to attract true affection or love. In fact, he was indeed such a man as Marshal Massena described. Marshal Massena, a good judge perhaps because he was himself an ambitious, grasping kind of man, said that Napoleon never loved anybody in his life. Women, men, children, nobody but himself. He was passionate in his ambition, hard as iron, and everything else. And I'm going to leave off at that point, bruv. Because, yeah, because I am.